I am Arthur, 34 years old. On a brisk Tuesday morning in October, I sat perfectly still inside a suffocatingly quiet courtroom in the Chatham County Courthouse, while my own mother stood on the witness stand and told a judge, under oath, that I was a complete failure who had manipulated my dying grandmother for her money. While I was fighting back tears, remembering the beautiful woman who had practically raised me and the agonizing months I spent watching cancer eat away at her frail body, my parents looked at me with absolute disgust from across the aisle. My mother, Margaret, gripping the polished wooden railing of the witness box so hard her knuckles were white, looked Judge Marcus Sterling dead in the eye. She took a deep breath, letting a perfectly manufactured tear roll down her powdered cheek, and said, "Arthur is just a useless son, Your Honor. He always has been. He disappeared for 10 years, contributed absolutely nothing to this family, and then swooped in at the very end to steal my mother-in-law's estate when she was too sick and confused to know what she was signing." They sneered at me right there in front of the bailiff, the stenographer, and the gallery packed with absolute strangers waiting for their own cases to be called. My older brother Julian sat right behind my parents, arms crossed over his chest, nodding vigorously at every poisonous word my mother spat out, looking like a king who had finally cornered a peasant. But there was a massive secret they didn't know. They had absolutely no idea about the life I had built during those 10 long years they spent ignoring my existence. They had no idea about my career, my reputation in this very city, and they certainly had no idea about the airtight legal trap they had just walked right into with their eyes wide open. And very soon, within the next 30 minutes of this hearing, those arrogant sneers would turn into desperate, panicked begging. Before I tell you exactly what happened to wipe the smug looks off their faces and bring their entire world crashing down, please hit that like button if you believe that justice always catches up to toxic people. And don't forget to let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Now, let's go back to where this nightmare actually started. Sitting in that courtroom, listening to the woman who gave birth to me assassinate my character for a paycheck, you would think I would be boiling with rage. You would think I would be jumping out of my seat, screaming objection, defending my honor. But honestly, I just felt a cold, hollow sense of profound familiarity. Being called useless wasn't a new experience for me. It was the background music of my entire childhood. It was the label stitched into the collar of my shirt since I was old enough to understand words. The air in the courtroom was incredibly thick, smelling of old paper, floor wax, and the cheap cologne worn by Victor Thorne, the sleazy attorney my parents had hired. I could hear the faint ticking of the large analog clock on the back wall, echoing the pounding rhythm of my own heartbeat. My lawyer, Harrison Vance, sat right next to me. Harrison was a legal titan in our state, a man who charged $1,000 an hour for his time, but he was representing me for free. He didn't flinch as my mother spoke. He didn't jump up to object. He just calmly took notes on his yellow legal pad, the gold pen gliding across the paper, letting my parents dig their own grave word by word, lie by lie. On the other side of the heavy oak aisle sat my father, Richard. He was wearing a stiff charcoal suit that looked like it hadn't been dry cleaned since the late 90s. He kept adjusting his tie, looking incredibly pleased with himself. Beside him was Julian. Julian was 37 years old, wearing a flashy, tight-fitting designer suit that was undoubtedly purchased on a credit card he had absolutely no intention of paying off. He leaned back in his heavy leather chair, stretching his legs out, looking around the courtroom as if he owned the entire building. My mother was putting on the performance of a lifetime on the stand. She kept dabbing at her eyes with a lace tissue. She painted a vivid, completely fictional picture of a loving, tight-knit, perfectly normal American family that had been cruelly torn apart by a greedy, estranged, and sociopathic son. Her attorney, Victor Thorne, a guy known around town for being loud, aggressive, and taking high-profile cases just to get his face on local television, paced the floor like a hungry shark smelling blood in the water. He was eating up every second of this performance. He thought he had this lawsuit entirely in the bag. He genuinely believed he was dealing with a frightened, isolated young man who had no resources, no money, and no backbone to fight back against a coordinated family assault. I looked down at my hands, resting flat on the heavy mahogany defense table. I wasn't that frightened kid anymore. I hadn't been that kid in a very long time. But looking at my parents, looking at the pure venom in my mother's eyes when she glanced my way, I was suddenly transported back to the house I grew up in. A house where my mere presence was treated like an unfortunate inconvenience. They wanted to talk about my character in a court of law? They wanted to put my history on trial? Fine. But the truth about our family wasn't the polished, Homeowners Association approved version my mother was selling to the judge. The truth was dark. It was profoundly ugly. And it was the exact reason I had spent my entire adult life grinding my bones to dust, making sure I would never, ever have to depend on them for a single crumb of support. I thought the absolute worst of the trauma was over when I finally packed my bags and left home at 18. I thought I had outrun the ghosts of my childhood. I was so incredibly wrong. Growing up in our large, suburban house felt exactly like living in an expensive museum where I was the only person not allowed to touch the exhibits. My parents, Richard and Margaret, had 3 children, but if you walked into our living room and looked at the framed photo albums neatly arranged on the fireplace mantel, you would honestly think they only had 2. Julian was the undisputed golden child. He was the firstborn son, the handsome, charismatic high school athlete, the one my father proudly paraded around at neighborhood barbecues and country club dinners. Whatever Julian wanted, Julian got, no questions asked. He wanted a new guitar? It was in his room the next day. He wanted to go on a ski trip with his friends? My parents wrote the check. Then there was Cecilia, my younger sister by 5 years. She was the baby of the family, coddled and spoiled beyond belief, treated like a delicate porcelain princess who could do absolutely no wrong. If Cecilia broke a vase, my mother would ask if she had cut her hand. If I dropped a fork, I was screamed at for being clumsy and careless. And then there was me, Arthur, the middle child, the mistake, the placeholder. I learned very early on that love in my house was a strict currency, and my account was chronically overdrawn. I remember the Thanksgiving dinners with crystal-clear agony. The massive mahogany dining room table would be groaning under the weight of a huge roasted turkey, expensive wines, stuffing, and homemade cranberry sauce. The house would smell like cinnamon and butter. Julian would always be given the prime cuts of meat, the first massive slice of pumpkin pie. My parents would spend the entire 2-hour meal leaning in, asking him about his football games, his popularity, his grand plans for the future. They would coo over Cecilia's ballet recitals. I would sit at the far end of the table, near the kitchen door, silently pushing peas around my plate, completely invisible. If I tried to speak, if I tried to share a story about a book I read or a project I did at school, I was quickly interrupted or simply talked over as if I hadn't made a sound. Mostly, I was just instructed to go out to the freezing garage fridge to fetch more ice or clear the dirty plates while the real family enjoyed their dessert. I was smart. I worked hard. I got straight A's in every single subject. I thought maybe, just maybe, if I proved I was intelligent, if I brought home perfect scores, they would look at me the way they looked at Julian. I remember bringing home a flawless report card in my sophomore year of high school. I had worked for months to get the highest grade in my advanced calculus class. I proudly placed the crisp piece of paper on the kitchen island right in front of my dad. He barely glanced up from his morning newspaper, gave a dismissive, annoyed grunt, and physically pushed the report card off the counter to make room for his coffee mug. It fluttered to the floor. He didn't even say good job. The very next day, Julian brought home a report card with 2 Ds and an F in basic algebra. My parents actually took him out to an expensive steakhouse dinner to cheer him up, because they felt he was under so much tremendous pressure from his coaches. But the real breaking point, the exact moment the heavy blinders fell off my eyes completely, happened the summer right before my senior year of high school. I had been accepted into a highly competitive pre-law summer program at a prestigious university in Atlanta. It was a massive opportunity, something that could guarantee me a spot in a top-tier college and set me up for a brilliant legal career. I had spent countless nights writing the essays, submitting the applications in secret. The only catch was the tuition. It wasn't astronomical, maybe $2,000, but it was much more than I could afford with my minimum wage part-time job stocking heavy boxes at the local Walmart. I swallowed my pride, walked into the living room where my parents were watching television, and asked if they could help me out. I didn't ask for a handout. I asked for a loan from my college fund, a fund I knew they had set up years ago. I promised I would pay them back every single cent with interest once I started working. My mother actually laughed out loud. It wasn't a warm laugh. It was the kind of sharp, mocking sound that cuts right through your ribs and freezes your lungs. "Arthur," she said, not even bothering to look away from the television screen. "We can't just throw good money away on some silly summer camp. You aren't going to be a lawyer. Be realistic. We need to invest our money in a sure thing." That sure thing turned out to be Julian's newest, most delusional obsession. Julian had decided, after dropping out of community college for the second time, that he was going to be a luxury entrepreneur. He wanted to start an exotic car rental business right there in our quiet suburb. Despite having zero business experience, zero financial literacy, and a terrifying history of crashing his own cheap sedans. Exactly 1 week after my parents told me they didn't have a single dime for my education, my father proudly marched into a bank, co-signed massive, high-interest loans, and drained a massive chunk of their retirement savings to fund Julian's wild dream. I remember standing in the driveway, holding a dripping black trash bag I was taking out to the curb, watching a massive flatbed truck pull up to our house. It delivered Julian's initial business fleet, a gleaming, jet black Porsche 911 and a bright, obnoxious yellow Lamborghini Huracan. The loud, aggressive roar of the engines shook the windows of our house. Neighbors were peeking through their blinds. The thick smell of fresh leather and high-octane fuel filled the humid suburban air. My parents were running around the driveway, taking dozens of photos of Julian leaning against the hood of the Lamborghini, popping a bottle of champagne, cheering as if he had just cured a major disease. I stood there by the smelly garbage cans, completely invisible as always. I watched the champagne foam run down the driveway. That was the day the absolute last shred of hope I had for their love died. It didn't fade away. It was brutally executed. I realized, with a terrifying clarity, that I was entirely on my own in this world. I didn't argue. I didn't yell. I didn't throw a fit. I quietly walked back inside, took on a second job washing greasy dishes at a 24-hour diner, and worked until my hands bled and my back ached permanently. I saved every single dollar, hiding the cash in an old shoebox under my bed. The only refuge I had left, the only person on this entire planet who looked at me and actually saw a living, breathing human being with a soul, was my grandmother, Eleanor. She was my dad's mother. She lived a few towns over in a modest, beautiful old Victorian house with a wraparound porch that smelled of blooming jasmine and dried lavender. Every Sunday, regardless of the weather, I would ride my beat-up, rusty bicycle for an hour just to sit on that porch with her. She was sharp as a tack, incredibly witty, and fiercely independent. While my parents treated me like a stray dog they were forced to feed, Grandma Eleanor treated me like an absolute treasure. We would sit on her creaky wooden porch swing, drinking cold sweet tea, and she would actually listen to me. She asked about my grades, my big dreams of becoming a civil rights lawyer, my deep-seated fears of failure. She never judged me. She never interrupted. The day I finally left for college, a state school I was paying for entirely on my own with crippling student loans and years of diner tips, nobody in my house even said goodbye. My parents were too busy in the garage, helping Julian desperately try to detail his Porsche for a client who ultimately never showed up. But Grandma Eleanor was waiting for me at the Greyhound bus station. She was leaning heavily on her cane, wearing her best Sunday dress. She hugged me so tight I thought my ribs would crack. She slipped a plain, sealed white envelope into my jacket pocket, patting my chest firmly. Inside was a handwritten note on her personalized stationery and $500 in crisp, new bills. I opened it on the bus. The note read, "Arthur, my brave, brilliant boy, the people who refuse to see your value do not get the right to price you. You are worth the world. Go build an empire. I love you always." I held that envelope against my chest for the entire 5-hour bus ride to Atlanta. I looked out the window at the passing highway, and I made a silent, unbreakable vow to myself. I promised that I would never be poor, I would never be helpless, and I would never, ever let my toxic family make me feel small again. I disappeared completely into my new life, determined to prove them all wrong through sheer, undeniable success. I thought I had escaped the toxicity forever. I thought cutting them off was the end of the story. But family trauma is a relentless, suffocating shadow, and 10 years later, it came crawling back to drag me straight into hell. The next 10 years of my life were a blur of pure, unadulterated, bone-crushing grinding. I didn't experience a normal college life. I didn't go to wild frat parties on the weekends. I didn't take relaxing spring break vacations to the beach. I ate cheap, sodium-packed ramen noodles in the basement of the law library at 3 in the morning, surrounded by towering, intimidating stacks of constitutional case law books. I worked 3 different part-time jobs just to keep a roof over my head while maintaining a 4.0 GPA. The hard work paid off. I graduated at the absolute top of my class. I passed the grueling state bar exam on my very first try, scoring in the top 1 percentile. I started working my way up the legal ladder in Savannah, starting as a junior associate at a cutthroat firm before realizing my heart wasn't in corporate defense. I wanted to help people. I transitioned to becoming a defense attorney, focusing intensely on civil rights and complex family law. I specifically took the nightmare cases that other lawyers actively avoided, the messy, traumatic divorces where a wealthy, powerful spouse was using high-priced lawyers to crush a vulnerable one, the terrifying custody battles where innocent children were being used as leverage by narcissistic parents. I fought tooth and nail in courtrooms for people who felt exactly like I did growing up. Voiceless, terrified, and completely invisible. Eventually, my reputation grew so large that I opened my own firm. Business absolutely boomed. I had a team of paralegals and junior partners working under me. I was making a massive, life-changing salary. But the money wasn't enough. I wanted to leave a legacy. So, I used a large portion of my own wealth to found a nonprofit organization, the Eleanor Legal Foundation, named after the only woman who believed in me. We provided completely free legal representation to domestic abuse survivors and foster children navigating a broken system. I was respected by judges, feared by opposing counsel, and beloved by my clients. To my biological family, however, I remained a total ghost. I changed my phone number. I didn't call on holidays. They didn't reach out. I missed a decade of Thanksgivings, Christmases, birthdays, and anniversaries. The silence was incredibly peaceful. It was the first time in my life my nervous system wasn't constantly on high alert. Then, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, the phone on my massive oak desk rang. It wasn't a client. It was Dr. Eris, a senior physician from the local hospital back in my hometown. Grandma Eleanor had been diagnosed with aggressive terminal pancreatic cancer. The prognosis was devastatingly grim. She had weeks left, maybe a couple of months if she fought hard. I dropped absolutely everything. I didn't even finish the cup of coffee on my desk. I handed my entire heavy caseload over to my senior partners, packed a single duffel bag with dark suits and comfortable clothes, and drove 3 hours straight to her house. I moved into her spare bedroom that very night. The next 2 months were undeniably the hardest, most emotionally agonizing days of my entire life. I had faced down screaming prosecutors and hostile witnesses, but nothing prepares you for watching the strongest person you know wither away. I learned how to manage a terrifying array of liquid morphine and pain medications. I learned how to operate heavy, noisy oxygen tanks. I learned how to hold a plastic basin with steady hands while the woman I loved most in the world was violently ill in the middle of the night. I barely slept, dozing on a small, uncomfortable cot right at the foot of her bed so I could hear her breathing. Do you want to know exactly where my biological family was during this nightmare? My father never came. Not once. He told a neighbor who bumped into him at the grocery store that he couldn't handle hospitals, and seeing his mother sick depressed him too much. Julian was entirely too busy. His ridiculous luxury car rental business had predictably crashed and burned years ago in a spectacular fireball of debt, and he was currently jumping from one failed multi-level marketing scheme to the next, still living comfortably in my parents' basement rent-free. Cecilia, the princess, sent a generic store-bought get-well-soon card with a printed signature. My mother, Margaret, visited exactly once during those grueling 8 weeks. She walked into Eleanor's sterile, medical equipment-filled bedroom on a Tuesday afternoon, loudly complaining about the highway traffic and the humidity. She stood awkwardly at the foot of the bed, her arms crossed, refusing to even touch Eleanor's fragile, bruised hand. After 5 agonizing minutes of shallow, forced small talk about the weather, my mother looked around the beautiful, antique-filled room, her eyes calculating the value of the vintage furniture. She looked at my dying grandmother and actually asked, "So, Eleanor, have you had the house appraised recently? Real estate prices in this specific neighborhood are skyrocketing right now. It would be a shame not to know the market value." Eleanor, weak but still possessing a spirit of pure steel, looked at her daughter-in-law with an expression of absolute, freezing ice. She gathered her breath, looked Margaret in the eye and rasped, "You can leave my house now, Margaret, and don't bother coming back." My mother scoffed, huffed loudly, smoothed her expensive skirt, and walked out without another word. That was the absolute last time any of them saw her alive. When Grandma Eleanor finally passed away a week later, holding my hand as the sun came up, the grief was so heavy it nearly crushed my lungs. I sat in the quiet room for hours. I arranged the entire funeral completely on my own. I paid for the casket, the flowers, the burial plot. My parents, Julian, and Cecilia showed up to the church ceremony wearing expensive, tailored black designer clothes, playing the part of the deeply grieving family for the benefit of the watching neighbors. They accepted condolences with sad nods. They didn't shed a single genuine tear. I watched them from the front pew, feeling absolutely nothing but profound disgust. 2 weeks after we put her in the ground, we were all formally summoned to the downtown office of Franklin, Eleanor's longtime estate lawyer, for the official reading of the last will and testament. My parents sat in the plush leather chairs in Franklin's waiting room, practically vibrating with uncontained greed. They knew the large house on Oak Street was fully paid off. They knew Eleanor had a substantial, diversified investment portfolio she had built over 40 years. They were already spending the inheritance in their heads, whispering excitedly to Julian about paying off debts and buying a new boat. Franklin, a quiet, serious man in his 60s, called us into his office. He adjusted his thick glasses, cleared his throat loudly, and read the legal document. It was short, binding, and brutally clear. "I, Eleanor, being of sound mind and body, leave my entire estate, including my residential home, all financial assets, checking accounts, and personal belongings, entirely and solely to my grandson Arthur. He is the only one who showed up when I was dying. He is the only one who cared. To my son Richard and his wife Margaret, I leave nothing." The silence that fell over that small office was absolutely deafening. You could hear a pin drop, and then the explosion happened. My father turned purple. He slammed his heavy fist onto Franklin's glass desk so hard the coffee cups rattled. My mother jumped out of her chair and started screaming hysterically, her face turning a mottled, furious red. "This is a mistake. This is illegal," she shrieked, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "He brainwashed her. He isolated a sick, confused old woman and forced her to sign this garbage." Julian stepped forward, looking like he wanted to punch me. "You little rat. You planned this the whole time." I sat there quietly in my chair, looking at the 3 of them acting like rabid animals deprived of a meal. I didn't raise my voice. I looked at my mother and said evenly, "She wasn't isolated, Mother. She was just sitting in her room, waiting for people who never bothered to knock." I stood up, buttoned my suit jacket, and walked out of the office, leaving them throwing a massive, screaming tantrum in the lobby. I honestly thought the money would be legally transferred to me, probate would clear, and that would be the permanent end of it. I severely underestimated the terrifying lengths desperate people will go to. A few days later, my cousin Leo reached out. Leo was my dad's nephew, someone I used to play video games with when we were kids before the family completely fractured. He called my cell phone, saying he heard through the grapevine about the massive family drama and wanted to check on me to see if I was holding up okay. He sounded genuine. He offered to buy me a beer and just let me vent. I was emotionally exhausted, deeply grieving my grandmother, and frankly, I just wanted someone in my bloodline to be normal and kind. I foolishly agreed. We met at a dimly lit, sticky-floored local pub called O'Malley's. Over 3 pints of beer, I poured my heart out. I vented about my parents' disgusting absence during Eleanor's final days, the severe trauma of providing hospice care alone, and how I just wanted to protect Eleanor's legacy from their greedy claws. I told him I finally had the control to make sure they never touched her things. Exactly 2 weeks later, while I was sitting in my office reviewing a brief, a process server walked through my glass doors and handed me a thick manila envelope. I had been served with a massive civil lawsuit. My parents were officially contesting the will, suing me for undue influence, fraud, and elder abuse, and their primary, highly touted piece of evidence attached to the discovery file, an audio recording. Leo had worn a hidden wire to the pub. He had secretly recorded our entire 2-hour emotional conversation, and then he, or whoever my parents hired, had maliciously spliced and heavily edited the audio file. They cut out all my context about hospice care, rearranging my vulnerable words so it sounded like I was arrogantly bragging about taking aggressive control of Eleanor's life, isolating her from the loving family, and manipulating her mind just to secure the massive bag. Cousin Leo had completely sold me out to my parents for a promised, lucrative cut of the inheritance. They thought they had me completely cornered. They thought the edited tape and their coordinated lies would destroy me in probate court, bankrupt me with legal fees, and force me to hand over the keys to the house. But they didn't realize that in their blind, rabid greed, they had just declared total legal war on a man who practically lived, breathed, and hunted in a courtroom. The exact moment I finished reading the thick, heavily stapled lawsuit document, the anger inside me evaporated, replaced instantly by a cold, hyper-focused, terrifying calm. I wasn't the grieving, heartbroken grandson anymore. I wasn't the traumatized little boy looking for his mother's approval. I was Arthur the litigator. I was the man who tore apart hostile witnesses for a living, and they had just stepped into my arena. I knew the golden rule of law. Any lawyer who represents himself has a fool for a client. Emotions cloud judgment, and I needed someone cold and clinical to execute this execution. So, I picked up my phone and called Harrison Vance. Harrison was a heavyweight legal brawler. We had faced off on opposite sides of the aisle a few times over the years, and the man was an absolute legal bulldog. He was brilliant, ruthless, and highly respected by every judge in the district. When I walked into his massive corner office, handed him the lawsuit file, and explained the entire twisted situation with the edited tape and my parents' claims, a slow, incredibly dangerous smile spread across his weathered face. "Arthur," Harrison said, tossing the file onto his polished mahogany desk with a loud smack. "They brought a cheap plastic butter knife to a thermonuclear gunfight. Let's completely dismantle them." The opposition was represented by Victor Thorne. Thorne was exactly the kind of lawyer you hired from a late-night television commercial or a highway billboard, flashy pinstripe suits, a booming, theatrical voice, and a reputation for using aggressive, underhanded tactics meant to bully the other side into a quick, panicked financial settlement. His very first move was to try and drown us in massive discovery requests. He demanded my personal bank statements, 10 years of my full tax returns, my entire cellular phone history, and every single medical document related to Eleanor's cancer treatment. He wanted to exhaust me. He wanted to paint a convincing picture for the judge of me as a broke, desperate, estranged kid who desperately needed a massive payday and manipulated a dying woman to get it. I sat in Harrison's office, looking at the towering stack of subpoenas Thorne had sent over. "Give them everything," I told Harrison, my voice devoid of any emotion. "Every single piece of paper. Let them drown in it. Let them waste their billable hours reading about my nonprofit donations. But I wasn't just going to play defense. While Thorne was wasting his precious time combing through my absolutely flawless financial records, my brilliant lead assistant, Elena, and I launched our own massive counter-investigation. In civil litigation, discovery goes both ways. We issued aggressive subpoenas for my parents' complete banking records, their mortgage statements, their credit card bills, and their tax returns. If they wanted a brutal war of attrition, I was going to show them how a seasoned professional does it. What Elena and I found combing through those boxes over the next few weeks was absolutely staggering. It painted a horrifying picture of absolute, unmitigated financial desperation on their end. My parents weren't just being greedy. They were drowning in a financial ocean of their own making. Remember Julian's exotic car rental business? The one my father proudly co-signed for a decade ago? Turns out Julian hadn't just defaulted on the massive business loans. When the business started failing, he had secretly convinced my father to take out a massive second mortgage on my parents' primary house to cover the balloon payments on that Lamborghini and Porsche. Both luxury cars had been repossessed by the bank years ago after Julian crashed one and stopped paying for the other, but the massive debt remained, compounding at a horrifying, predatory interest rate. But incredibly, that wasn't even the worst part of their financial autopsy. Elena tracked a series of massive, panicked wire transfers leaving my parents' 401k and retirement accounts over the last 5 years. They had been sending tens of thousands of dollars in a steady stream to my mother's younger sister, Aunt Beatrice. We dug into it. Beatrice had convinced them to invest their entire life savings into a can't-lose, guaranteed return, luxury real estate development project in Florida. We looked up the LLC. It was a complete phantom shell company. The land they supposedly bought was a toxic, protected swamp that couldn't be built on. Beatrice had completely bled them dry, vanished, and their retirement accounts were practically sitting at zero. My parents were facing imminent foreclosure. They were functionally bankrupt. The only thing standing between them and living in a cheap, rundown motel was Grandma Eleanor's multi-million-dollar estate. They needed that inheritance just to survive the year, and they were fully willing to destroy my life, frame me for a felony elder abuse charge, and drag my beloved grandmother's name through the absolute mud to get their hands on it. "They're a cornered animal," Harrison said, reviewing the highlighted financial spreadsheets Elena had neatly printed out and laid across the conference table. "They're absolutely terrified of being homeless. That's exactly why Thorne is acting so incredibly aggressively. They need a settlement, fast. They want you to pay them to go away." "We offer them absolutely nothing," I replied, staring at the paper showing my father's second mortgage default. "We don't settle for a dime. We take this all the way to trial, and we expose everything on the public record." The night before the highly anticipated probate hearing, I drove out to Grandma Eleanor's house. The property was legally in probate limbo, untouchable until the judge ruled, but I still had the heavy brass keys. I sat on the old creaky wooden porch swing, the autumn air cooling rapidly as the sun dipped below the treeline. The sweet scent of dried lavender still lingered in the overgrown garden. I drank black coffee from a metal thermos, staring out at the quiet, peaceful street. Tomorrow morning, my character was going to be publicly assassinated by the two people who were biologically supposed to protect me. They were going to play that doctored, malicious tape. They were going to lie under oath to a judge. They were going to try to paint me as a calculating monster. I reached into the breast pocket of my jacket, where I permanently kept the old, slightly wrinkled white envelope Eleanor had given me at the bus station over a decade ago. I ran my thumb over her elegant handwriting. "Those who don't see your value don't get to price you." I wasn't nervous. My heart rate was steady. I was profoundly ready. I had the absolute truth. I had the devastating financial evidence. And I knew that Judge Sterling was notoriously intolerant of perjury and nonsense in his courtroom. I took a deep, cleansing breath of the night air, closed my eyes, and prepared my mind for the slaughter. Tomorrow, the invisible, useless child was going to bring down their whole house of cards, brick by brick. I just didn't expect how spectacularly bright the explosion was going to be. The morning of the probate hearing finally arrived, bringing with it a thick, suffocating humidity that hung over the city of Savannah. I walked up the wide, worn marble steps of the Chatham County Courthouse, a building I knew intimately. I had spent countless hours inside these very walls, fighting tooth and nail for clients who had been battered by the brutal realities of family court, brutal divorces, and terrifying custody battles. The courthouse always buzzed with a specific, chaotic energy, a mix of high-stakes anxiety, aggressive posturing by expensive attorneys, and the quiet, desperate tears of people whose lives were falling apart. Usually, I was the armored shield for those people. Today, I was the one sitting in the crosshairs. But unlike the terrified clients I usually represented, I felt an eerie, absolute calm settling deep into my bones. I pushed through the heavy wooden double doors of courtroom 4B. The air inside smelled faintly of lemon floor wax and old paper. I took my seat at the heavy mahogany defense table. My attorney, Harrison Vance, sat down next to me. Harrison was a legal titan in our state. He wore a perfectly tailored navy suit, and his demeanor was completely relaxed. He opened his thick, meticulously organized leather binder, placed his expensive gold pen on top of his legal pad, and leaned back in his chair. He didn't look like a man preparing for a difficult battle. He looked like a man who already knew the final score of the game. Across the center aisle, the plaintiff's table was a stark contrast. My parents, Richard and Margaret, looked as though they had already won the lottery and were simply enduring a minor administrative delay before collecting their massive, unearned payout. My father was wearing a stiff charcoal suit that looked like it hadn't been properly tailored since the late 1990s. He kept adjusting his tie, whispering aggressively to their attorney, Victor Thorne. My mother was dressed in a conservative, highly calculated beige dress, clutching a lace handkerchief in her lap, ready to deploy fake tears at a moment's notice. Right behind them, sitting in the front row of the public gallery, was my older brother, Julian. He had shown up wearing a flashy, tight-fitting designer suit that screamed of credit card debt. He sat with his legs wide open, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, looking around the courtroom with a smug, highly arrogant expression. He occasionally leaned forward over the wooden divider to whisper what he probably considered brilliant legal strategy into my mother's ear. They had completely convinced themselves that this lawsuit was a mere, simple formality. They genuinely believed that Victor Thorne, their loud, aggressively tanned, billboard advertising lawyer, was going to easily steamroll right over me. They thought they could bully me into handing over Grandma Eleanor's inheritance, the real estate, and the financial portfolio without breaking a sweat. The heavy wooden door behind the bench swung open, and the bailiff called the room to order. Judge Marcus Sterling took his seat. Judge Sterling was a highly respected, deeply serious man who absolutely did not tolerate fools, perjury, or theatrical nonsense in his courtroom. He had a fierce reputation for reading every single page of discovery submitted to his chamber before he ever put his black robe on. He adjusted his reading glasses, looked over the massive file in front of him, and nodded for the plaintiffs to begin. Victor Thorne stood up, buttoned his expensive suit jacket with a dramatic flourish, and approached the wooden podium with the swagger of a man who loved the sound of his own booming voice. He spent the first 20 agonizing minutes of the hearing painting a picture so wildly inaccurate and deeply fictional that it bordered on science fiction. He described my parents, Richard and Margaret, as deeply devoted, intensely loving caregivers who had been completely blindsided by a manipulative, money-hungry, estranged son. He confidently threw around heavy, damaging legal terms like fraud, coercion, and felony elder abuse. He desperately tried to construct a believable narrative for the judge where I had swooped into town at the final hour, aggressively isolated Grandma Eleanor from her supposedly loving family, and forcefully coerced her into changing her will to secure a massive payday for myself. "Your Honor," Thorne boomed, gesturing dramatically toward my parents. "My clients have suffered an unimaginable emotional trauma. They were robbed of their final precious moments with their beloved mother by a calculating, greedy individual who saw a vulnerable, heavily medicated old woman and saw nothing but dollar signs. We will prove that Arthur executed a malicious campaign of isolation and undue influence. After his ridiculous opening statement, Thorne called my father to the witness stand. My father walked up, took the oath with a completely straight face, placed his hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the whole truth. He sat in the wooden witness box, adjusted his cheap tie again, and began to lie to the court with a level of ease and practiced comfort that honestly disturbed me on a psychological level. Under Thorne's highly leading, carefully rehearsed questions, my father described a beautiful, close-knit, entirely fabricated relationship with his mother. He looked the judge in the eye and claimed he visited her multiple times a week, that he called her every single Sunday afternoon, and that he was an active, deeply concerned participant in all of her complex healthcare decisions. "And Mr. Richard?" Thorne asked, pacing in front of the jury box. "Why were you not present during your mother's final days?" My father let his shoulders slump, putting on a face of profound, manufactured grief. "Because I was locked out, Your Honor. My son, Arthur, moved into the house and completely changed the locks. He refused to answer the door. He wouldn't return my desperate phone calls. I was completely cut off from my own mother when she needed me the absolute most. I sat at the defense table, my face a completely blank, unreadable mask of cold stone. I didn't shake my head in disbelief. I didn't roll my eyes at the absurd perjury. I didn't show a single ounce of emotion. I just sat perfectly still and let him weave the thick, heavy rope he was about to hang his entire future with. Next, Thorne called my mother to the stand. This was the main event. Margaret had clearly spent the entire morning in front of a mirror rehearsing her performance. She took the stand slowly, clutching her lace handkerchief tightly, her eyes darting nervously around the room to make absolutely sure everyone in the gallery was watching her dramatic display. "Mrs. Margaret," Thorne said, using a soft, overly sympathetic, almost sickeningly sweet tone, "can you please describe to the court the exact nature of your relationship with your son, the defendant Arthur?" My mother let out a long, heavy, incredibly dramatic breath. She looked over at the defense table, and for a split second, the fake sorrow completely dropped from her face. In that brief moment, I saw the absolute, raw, unfiltered hatred in her eyes. It was the exact same look she had given me when I asked for a tiny loan from my own college fund so many years ago. It was the look of a woman looking at a deeply disappointing insect. "Arthur was always a very difficult, very cold child," she said, her voice trembling with perfect, theatrical precision. "We gave him absolutely everything. We loved him just as much as our other beautiful children, but he constantly rejected us. He walked out of our loving home 10 years ago without a single backward glance. He didn't come to our Thanksgiving dinners. He didn't call on our birthdays. He completely abandoned his family to chase his own selfish, isolated ambitions." She paused to dab at her completely dry eyes, sniffing loudly for the court reporter to hear. "When my poor, sweet mother-in-law got sick with that terrible cancer, we were absolutely devastated. We wanted to be there for her. We wanted to hold her hand. But Arthur suddenly appeared out of nowhere after a decade of silence. He moved into her beautiful house and absolutely refused to let us see her. He manipulated a dying, heavily medicated old woman. He poisoned her fragile mind against us just so he could steal the valuable real estate and the money she had always promised to us to help support our family." Thorne leaned forward, resting his elbows heavily on the wooden podium, sensing the climax of his direct examination. "And Mrs. Margaret, why do you think your own son would do such a terrible, destructive thing to his own loving family?" My mother gripped the wooden railing of the witness box. She raised her chin, looked Judge Marcus Sterling dead in the very center of his eyes, and delivered the exact line she had been waiting her entire miserable life to say on the public record. "Because Arthur is just a useless son, Your Honor. He always has been. He has never contributed a single positive thing to this family. He is a total failure who couldn't make it out there in the real world on his own. So he decided to prey on a vulnerable, sick woman to get a free ride." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the entire courtroom. In the gallery, I could see Julian smirking widely out of the corner of my eye. My father nodded solemnly, playing the part of the heartbroken patriarch. Victor Thorne looked up at the judge, clearly expecting a reaction of profound sympathy and outrage for these poor, intensely victimized parents. I didn't react. I didn't break eye contact with the woman who gave birth to me. I just sat there, breathing evenly, feeling the cold, hard-polished wood of the defense table under my fingertips. I let the toxic words hang in the heavy air. Useless son. Total failure. It was the absolute culmination of 34 long years of psychological and emotional abuse, finally packaged up and presented under oath in a court of law. I leaned over to Harrison Vance, never taking my eyes off my mother, and whispered very quietly, "Let's end this right now." Harrison Vance stood up slowly from his heavy leather chair. He didn't rush. He didn't look angry, flustered, or intimidated by the heavy emotional performance that had just taken place. He looked exactly like a highly experienced poker player who had just been dealt an unbeatable royal flush and was simply taking a moment to decide exactly how much money he was going to take off the table before ending the game. "No questions for this witness at this time, Your Honor," Harrison said, his deep voice completely calm and level. Victor Thorne looked visibly confused. He blinked rapidly, clearly thrown off his rehearsed script. My mother looked deeply disappointed, as if she had spent weeks preparing for a brutal, screaming cross-examination and was intensely upset she didn't get the opportunity to deliver more of her carefully memorized, venomous lines. She stepped down from the elevated witness box and returned to her seat next to my father, looking incredibly smug, assuming Harrison's lack of questions meant we had completely surrendered. Thorne confidently approached the wooden podium once again, straightening his bright silk tie. "Your Honor, the plaintiffs rest their case. We firmly believe the deeply moving testimony you just heard, combined with the incredibly disturbing audio recording submitted into evidence, clearly demonstrates a textbook, undeniable case of undue influence, coercion, and elder abuse." Judge Marcus Sterling did not look at Victor Thorne. In fact, he had completely stopped taking notes halfway through my mother's dramatic testimony. He slowly took off his thick reading glasses, placed them carefully and deliberately on his polished desk, and folded his hands tightly together. He looked over at my parents' table, his facial expression completely unreadable and stoic, before slowly locking his piercing eyes directly onto Victor Thorne. "Mr. Thorne," Judge Sterling said, his voice low, steady, and carrying an incredibly dangerous edge that made the temperature in the room drop. "Before I allow Mr. Vance to present the defense's case, I have a very simple, straightforward question for you." "Of course, Your Honor." "Anything," Thorne replied, flashing a bright, overly confident, artificially whitened smile. "Do you have absolutely any idea who the defendant in this case actually is? Do you really not know who Arthur is?" Thorne blinked again, his bright smile faltering slightly at the edges. "He is the grandson of the deceased, Your Honor, the estranged, unemployed son of my clients." Judge Sterling's jaw tightened visibly. "That is his basic biological relation, Counselor. I am asking if you, as a licensed officer of this court, did even a basic 5-minute Google background check on the man you just aggressively accused of being a desperate, unemployed fraud in my courtroom." The courtroom went absolutely dead silent. The stenographer's fingers hovered completely still over her mechanical keyboard. My parents' smug, victorious expressions instantly vanished, replaced by a sudden, creeping, terrifying confusion. Julian stopped leaning forward over the gallery divider and sat back, suddenly looking highly uncomfortable. Thorne swallowed hard, a drop of sweat forming on his heavily tanned forehead. I relied entirely on the comprehensive background information provided by my clients, Your Honor." Judge Sterling picked up a thick, heavily tabbed file from his desk and opened it with a loud snap. "Since your clients have just spent the last hour committing what borders on aggressive, highly malicious perjury in my courtroom, allow me to educate you and them. The man quietly sitting at the defense table, the man your client just called a useless failure, is Arthur. He is the founding senior partner of one of the most successful, highly respected civil rights law firms in the entire state of Georgia. He is the founder and primary funder of the Eleanor Legal Foundation, a massive nonprofit organization that provides completely free legal counsel to hundreds of victims of severe domestic violence. Judge Sterling paused, letting the heavy words sink deeply into the silent room. He looked directly at my mother, who had gone completely, shockingly pale. The color drained from her face so fast she looked physically ill, her jaw hanging slightly open. My father stared at me, his eyes wide with absolute panic, looking as if he were staring at a complete stranger. Furthermore, the judge continued, his powerful voice echoing off the tall wood-paneled walls, Arthur has stood in this exact courtroom, before me, on dozens of complex litigation occasions. He is widely known throughout the entire legal community of this city for his impeccable integrity, his massive professional salary, and his relentless dedication to fiercely protecting vulnerable people from exactly the kind of predatory, abusive behavior your clients are wildly accusing him of today. Victor Thorne looked like he had just been hit head-on by a massive freight train. He looked down at his yellow legal pad, then over at my parents with a look of pure, unadulterated fury, realizing instantly that they had completely lied to him about my financial status, my career, and my identity. He had walked blindly into a legal buzzsaw, and his professional reputation was about to be shredded. Harrison Vance chose that exact, perfect moment to stand up. If it pleases the court, the defense would like to briefly present our extremely conclusive evidence. It won't take long at all. Judge Sterling nodded sharply. Proceed, Mr. Vance. Harrison didn't call me to the stand. He didn't need my emotional testimony. He simply walked over to the court clerk and handed over a thick stack of officially certified, stamped legal documents. First, Your Honor, Harrison said, projecting his deep voice so everyone in the crowded gallery could hear clearly. Regarding the completely fabricated claim that my client aggressively isolated the deceased, we submit the official, heavily documented daily visitor logs maintained independently by the private hospice nursing staff over the last 2 extremely difficult months of Eleanor's life. These official logs show that Arthur was physically present at the home providing care for an average of 16 grueling hours a day. The logs also clearly show that Richard visited a total of 0 times. Julian visited a total of 0 times. And Margaret visited exactly once, for a documented duration of less than 7 minutes, during which she inquired about the real estate value of the property. My father slouched deeply down into his heavy chair, looking like he wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. Julian suddenly found the scuff marks on the floor tiles incredibly fascinating. Second, Harrison continued smoothly, holding up a certified, watermarked medical document. We submit the sworn, fully notarized legal affidavit of Dr. Aris, the chief senior oncologist who treated Eleanor. Dr. Aris officially testifies under penalty of perjury that Eleanor was completely lucid, of entirely sound mind, and highly fiercely independent until her final 48 hours. She ordered the drafting of her new will entirely on her own, passing a rigorous, specialized psychological evaluation specifically mandated by her estate lawyer to absolutely prevent this exact type of frivolous, greedy lawsuit from her estranged son. Harrison then turned his full, intimidating attention directly to Victor Thorne, who looked physically sick. Now, regarding the audio recording the plaintiffs submitted as their so-called smoking gun. The recording provided by Arthur's cousin, Leo. Thorne physically cringed back away from the podium. We aggressively hired an independent, highly respected, court-certified digital audio forensics expert to deeply analyze the digital file, Harrison said, pulling out a thick, bound analytical report. The expert conclusively found that the audio file was maliciously spliced, heavily edited, and digitally manipulated in 37 different specific places to intentionally completely alter the context of the deeply emotional conversation. Submitting manipulated, fraudulent digital evidence to this court is a severe violation of the law, and quite frankly, clear grounds for immediate professional disbarment. Judge Sterling glared down at Thorne with absolute venom. Is this true, Mr. Thorne? Did you submit fraudulent evidence to my court? Your Honor, I swear to you, I had absolutely no idea, Thorne stammered, his expensive fake tan looking suddenly sickly and gray. My clients provided the digital file to my office. I was aggressively assured by Richard and Margaret of its complete authenticity. Finally, Harrison said, delivering the absolute, devastating killing blow to their entire pathetic charade. We submit the subpoenaed, fully audited financial records of the plaintiffs. They claimed Arthur was a failure, desperate for money. These verified records prove the exact opposite. Richard and Margaret are currently facing imminent bank foreclosure on their primary suburban residence. Their massive, crippling debt stems directly from a high-interest second mortgage taken out to illegally finance a failed luxury car rental business for their son, Julian. A spectacularly failed business that resulted in the highly public repossession of a Lamborghini and a Porsche. Harrison pulled out one final sheet of paper, a bank wire transfer record. Furthermore, the plaintiffs have entirely drained their 401k and retirement accounts by foolishly wiring hundreds of thousands of dollars to a shady LLC known as Sunshine Estates. A brief, simple investigation by my office reveals this LLC is a verified fraudulent real estate swamp scam operated directly by Margaret's younger sister, Beatrice. The plaintiffs are functionally completely bankrupt. They initiated this vicious, malicious lawsuit not out of profound grief for a lost mother, but out of absolute, terrifying, desperate financial ruin. The silence in the massive courtroom was absolute and total. You could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vents and the rapid, panicked breathing of my father. My mother was silently weeping into her hands, her carefully constructed facade completely shattered. My father looked utterly broken, staring blankly at the wood grain of the table. Julian had shrunk down so far into his gallery seat, he looked like a terrified, trapped child. They had aggressively tried to bury me in the dark. They just didn't realize I was the one who owned all the heavy machinery. Judge Marcus Sterling did not hesitate for a single second. He didn't need to take a long recess into his chambers to consider the massive mountain of irrefutable evidence. He looked down from the high wooden bench, his face a hard mask of absolute judicial disgust and furious contempt. This is, without a doubt, one of the most shameful, deeply malicious, and entirely frivolous abuses of the legal system I have ever seen in my 20 years sitting on the bench, Judge Sterling announced, his voice slicing brutally through the heavy, humid air of the courtroom. To attempt to completely destroy the hard-earned, impeccable professional reputation of an upstanding citizen, to illegally manipulate digital audio evidence, and to violently drag the beautiful memory of a deceased woman through the mud simply to cover up your own wildly reckless financial mistakes is absolutely abhorrent. He picked up his heavy wooden gavel, his knuckles white. The plaintiff's ridiculous petition to contest the last will and testament is dismissed with extreme prejudice. The estate of Eleanor will be immediately released from probate limbo and transferred entirely and wholly to the defendant, Arthur. Furthermore, as a punitive measure for this staggering abuse of process, I am officially ordering the plaintiffs, Richard and Margaret, to pay the entirety of the defendant's highly expensive legal fees. Court is permanently adjourned. The loud, violent crack of the gavel hitting the sounding block echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. It was over. The nightmare was completely, legally, and permanently over. They had nothing left. Harrison Vance patted my shoulder firmly, snapped his thick leather briefcase shut, and gave me a quiet, respectful nod before turning and walking out of the courtroom. I stood up slowly, calmly buttoning my tailored suit jacket. I didn't look back at my parents' table. I didn't glance at Julian in the gallery. I simply turned and walked down the center aisle, pushing through the heavy wooden double doors out into the bright, echoing marble hallway of the courthouse. I was walking toward the bank of elevators when I heard the frantic, desperate clicking of heels, rapidly approaching behind me on the marble floor. Arthur, please wait. Just wait a minute. I stopped walking and slowly turned around. My mother was practically sprinting toward me, her face heavily streaked with ruined, running makeup, her chest heaving as she struggled to catch her breath. My father was a few slow paces behind her, looking completely physically defeated, his shoulders slumped, his eyes staring at his own shoes. Julian was nowhere to be seen. The golden child had clearly bolted for the emergency exit the exact second the judge's gavel came down, instantly running away from the massive consequences he had actively helped create. My mother stopped a few feet away from me. She looked up into my face, her eyes wide, frantically trying to force a look of maternal desperation and profound love that I knew for a fact did not exist. "Arthur, please," she begged, her voice shaking violently. "You have to understand us. We were just so incredibly stressed. The mounting debts, the constant calls from the bank, the terrifying foreclosure notices. Beatrice completely stole everything we had saved. We panicked. You're a wealthy, highly successful lawyer now, Arthur. You have so much money and a massive salary. We just needed a little bit of help. You can't let the bank take our family house. You're our son. We're family. Please." I looked down at the pathetic woman who had spent 34 years meticulously making sure I knew I was completely worthless. I looked at the broken father who had completely ignored my entire existence simply to cater to a golden child who had ultimately destroyed their lives. "We are not family," I said, my voice completely quiet, incredibly cold, and absolutely final. "Family is supposed to fiercely protect you. You tried to frame me for a felony elder abuse charge so you could pay off a high-interest loan on a repossessed Lamborghini. You stood on a public witness stand and called me a useless failure under oath in front of a judge." "I didn't mean it. I swear I didn't mean it," she cried hysterically, reaching out a shaking hand to grab my arm. I took a sharp, fast step back, refusing to let her toxic fingers touch my suit. "Yes, you did. You meant every single vicious word of it. You just didn't realize until 10 minutes ago that the useless son was the absolute only person on this entire planet capable of saving you from your own stupidity. But I am not going to save you. Do not ever contact me again. Do not send me letters. If you call my phone, if you show up at my law office, or if you ever come anywhere near Grandma Eleanor's real estate property, I will file a legal restraining order so incredibly fast it will make your head spin." I turned my back on them, stepped into the waiting elevator, and watched the heavy steel doors slowly slide shut on their shocked, horrified, completely ruined faces. That was the absolute last time I ever spoke to my biological parents. Fast forward exactly 1 full year. The heavy, unavoidable consequences of their actions finally caught up to them in a brutal, undeniable wave of absolute reality. Without the massive financial safety net of Eleanor's inheritance to save them, the bank officially foreclosed on the large suburban house. The property was seized to aggressively pay off the toxic second mortgage and the lingering, heavily compounded debts from Julian's exotic car disaster. Richard and Margaret were forced to pack whatever meager belongings they could fit into a small rented moving truck and move into a tiny, cramped, deeply depressing 2-bedroom apartment on the bad side of town. Julian, naturally, did not move into that tiny apartment with them to help pay the rent or take care of them. The exact moment the money completely dried up and the big house was gone, the golden child vanished into thin air. He packed his bags in the middle of the night and moved to Florida, chasing another highly delusional get-rich-quick scheme, leaving his elderly, entirely bankrupt parents to fend entirely for themselves. Cousin Leo, the treacherous rat who recorded me at the pub, was completely ostracized by the rest of the extended family once the absolute truth about his manipulation came out. They all got exactly what they deserved. But for me, the most profound, emotionally shattering moment of deep healing didn't come from watching their inevitable financial downfall. It came from a highly unexpected delivery. A month after the trial concluded, I was sitting in my corner office reviewing a brief when my assistant Elena brought in a small, padded manila envelope that had been hand-delivered by a private courier. It was from Franklin, Eleanor's estate lawyer. Inside was a small silver USB drive and a short handwritten note that simply read, "She explicitly told me to give this to you only after the dust completely settled." I plugged the small drive into my laptop. A video file popped up on the screen. I clicked play, my heart pounding in my chest. There was Grandma Eleanor. She was sitting in her favorite floral armchair in her bright living room, looking physically frail but incredibly mentally sharp. She smiled directly into the camera lens, radiating warmth. "Hello, my brave, brilliant Arthur," she said, her voice warm, steady, and incredibly familiar. "If you are watching this video, it means I am gone, and the terrible, ugly storm has finally passed. I know exactly what Richard and Margaret did. I knew they would try to aggressively contest the will. I knew they would try to violently drag your good name through the mud because they are desperately drowning in their own terrible financial choices." Hot tears immediately blurred my vision. I leaned closer to the bright screen, unable to breathe. "I could have easily set up an ironclad, irrevocable trust," she continued, taking a slow, labored breath. "I could have made it legally impossible for them to ever sue you. But I didn't. I purposefully, intentionally left the legal door wide open for them to contest it. Because I knew you, Arthur. I knew that your heart is entirely too big. I knew that if they cried and begged you, if they played the desperate victim, you might have felt an intense, misplaced guilt. You might have given them some of your hard-earned money out of a deeply ingrained sense of duty to people who never, ever loved you properly." She smiled, a fierce, intensely protective glint shining in her tired eyes. "I wanted them to show you their true, ugly faces in the most public, undeniable way possible. I wanted the court, the law, and the entire world to officially vindicate you. I wanted you to see them actively try to destroy you, so you could finally, permanently cut the toxic cord without a single ounce of lingering guilt or regret. You are entirely free now, my sweet boy. Go live your beautiful, massive life. I am so incredibly proud of you." The video ended, fading to black. I sat at my heavy desk, covered my face with my shaking hands, and sobbed. I wept deeply for the beautiful, incredibly wise woman who loved me so fiercely. She intentionally engineered a massive legal trap from beyond the grave just to fiercely protect my heart. She had given me the ultimate priceless gift: absolute permanent freedom. Today, my daily life looks completely, entirely different than the absolute nightmare I barely survived. I kept Grandma Eleanor's beautiful Victorian house. I didn't sell it. Instead, I spent months meticulously renovating it, replacing the old shingled roof, updating the ancient plumbing, and painting the interior walls in bright, warm, incredibly welcoming colors. But I kept the massive wraparound porch exactly the same. I kept the old creaky wooden porch swing, and I still meticulously grow sweet jasmine and purple lavender in the front garden. Every single Sunday morning, I sit out there on that swing with a hot cup of black coffee, breathing in the familiar scent, and I feel a profound, deeply unshakable sense of peace. I am finally, truly home. The Eleanor Legal Foundation has expanded massively since the trial. We recently received a massive federal grant, allowing me to hire 5 more full-time, highly aggressive civil rights attorneys. We no longer just handle intense domestic abuse cases. We have an entire, highly specialized division dedicated exclusively to fighting for vulnerable children who are stuck deep in the heavily broken foster care system. We fight for children who are incredibly used to feeling exactly like I did growing up: invisible, entirely unwanted, and deeply, painfully useless. I make absolutely sure they know their voices matter. I make sure they know they have a heavyweight, terrifyingly competent legal team fighting tooth and nail in their corner. I still personally take on highly complex family law and brutal custody cases at my private, wildly successful firm, but my perspective as a litigator has completely, permanently shifted. I don't just see the dry legal statutes written in books. I deeply see the human collateral. I know exactly what it looks like when highly toxic parents try to aggressively use the legal system to manipulate, terrorize, and completely destroy their targets. I see right through the blatant lies, the highly manufactured fake tears, and the aggressive courtroom posturing. And I dismantle them, case by agonizing case, file by massive file, utilizing every legal tool at my disposal. Sometimes, when I'm standing in a quiet courtroom waiting for a judge to take the high bench, I think back to that horrible, humid Tuesday morning. I vividly think about my mother standing on the wooden witness stand, aggressively calling me a useless failure under oath. I think about the sheer, staggering audacity of highly toxic people who violently demand your absolute loyalty while simultaneously holding a sharp knife directly to your back. If there is one absolute, undeniable truth I have learned from surviving my incredibly toxic family and navigating the brutal, bloody trenches of civil litigation for over a decade, it is exactly this. Biology does not automatically grant you a permanent VIP pass to someone's life. Being a parent is a profound, beautiful privilege, not a dictatorial absolute right. You cannot spend decades emotionally neglecting a child, treating them like a heavy burden, investing absolutely all of your love and financial resources into a spoiled golden child, and then violently demand respect and financial salvation when your own incredibly poor choices finally catch up to you. The people who absolutely refuse to see your immense value do not get the right to aggressively price you. You are absolutely not defined by the severe lack of love you received in your difficult childhood. You are not the terrible, deeply limiting, entirely fictional story they aggressively tried to write for you. You are defined entirely by what you choose to aggressively build from the broken, jagged pieces they carelessly left behind. I took the incredibly painful label of useless son, and I forged it into a heavy, unbreakable legal shield that now actively protects hundreds of innocent people. I built a massive, highly successful empire of empathy and justice exactly where they tried to leave a dark crater of self-doubt and depression. Setting absolute, incredibly permanent boundaries with highly toxic family members is not an act of cruelty. It is the absolute ultimate act of self-preservation. It is incredibly painful to physically walk away from the people who gave you your life, but sometimes walking away is the only possible, healthy way to ensure that you get to actually live yours. Do not ever let anyone, not a toxic parent, not an abusive sibling, not a manipulative spouse, make you feel a single ounce of guilt for fiercely protecting your peace, your hard-earned financial assets, and your mental health. If you are watching this video right now, and you are sitting alone in the dark, deeply feeling like the invisible, forgotten child in your own home, if you are completely breaking your back trying to desperately earn the love and approval of toxic parents who only actively acknowledge you when they need a massive favor or a financial loan, I want you to hear me incredibly clearly. Stop. Stop aggressively trying to water a completely dead, barren garden. Take all of that incredible, beautiful energy, all of that fierce, undeniable resilience you built just to survive them, and pour it directly into yourself. Build your own massive, beautiful, incredibly successful life. Find your chosen family, the people who love you for exactly who you are, not for what you can provide for them. Because the absolute greatest, most satisfying revenge against people who repeatedly told you that you would be nothing is waking up every single day and proving them spectacularly wrong by simply being deeply happy, wildly successful, and entirely, permanently untouchable. Have you ever faced something incredibly similar with your own highly toxic family? Have you ever had to draw a massive, permanent line in the sand and walk completely away from toxic, abusive relatives just to protect yourself? Share your incredible story in the comments below. I read them all, and there is so much deep power in knowing you are absolutely not alone in this difficult fight. And don't forget to aggressively hit the like button on this video and subscribe to the channel so you absolutely don't miss the next journey. Thank you so incredibly much for listening to my story today. Keep building your empire and never look back.